Did Ellen White prophesy of the California fires?
And he recently claimed that the fires sweeping through the area were God's judgment on the city.
The Bible tells us why God turned those cities into ashes. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly.
Homes in ashes.
If it was just us, I'd be really okay with this. But it's everybody. It's everything.
A lot of people come up here and they thank Jesus for this award. I want you to know that no one had less to do with this award than Jesus. He didn't help me a bit. Jesus, this award is my God now.
The Batman movie used the name of Jesus 21 times in blasphemy. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
My faith always taught me, what would Jesus do?
Yes.
And I know Jesus would be attending that pride parade. Jesus would be the grand marshal at the pride parade.
You ever read the Bible? God rested, took a rest. What was happening to you was you were performing a task, you up, and you thought, let me rest before I this up some more.
And our love's not a sin. Well, the Bible says it's so.
Well, the Bible says a lot of things, you know? Hey, how's it going?
God is dead. Hail Satan lives.
The duo hit the stage to deliver a majorly racy performance of their hit song Unholy.
And that's just a tiny tip of the massive iceberg. For years, Hollywood has mocked Christianity, promoted adultery, fornication, pornography, blasphemy, witchcraft, Satanism, and proudly pushed its agenda of what the Bible calls vile affections. Again, we don't know if those fires are the judgment of God, but we do know that they're not signs of His blessing, and we certainly have provoked His wrath.
I would like to get your thought on this quotation here. I'm going to put it on your screen. So in the light of, you make mention of the California fire and so on. So Last Day Events 113 speaks about Chicago and Los Angeles and how we ought not to build in these areas. And she speaks about here, large cities also passed before me as wickedness increased and protecting power of God was withdrawn. There were destruction, winds, and tempests. Buildings were destroyed by fire, shaken down by earthquakes. And she also said, this is the same. A similar caution was given in regard to building in Los Angeles. Now, we know there's an entire context, but just the fact that she made mention of earthquakes and fires in the light of these two major cities, I would like to get your thought on that. Do you think the California fire was a fulfillment of the words of Ellen White here in Paulson Collection?
I think that what's interesting is you could look at it two ways. You could say, well, if you say a big city and eventually something's going to happen in that city, right? And you could say, well, it's been so many hundred years. Of course, there's going to be a fire, right? Now this one is quite a large fire. I think there's another example, like she mentions Memphis. Right, she's going to say that she saw large balls of fire fall into Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, and so there's some definite predictions that she's had that haven't come true yet, but there's other ones that have already come true, and the question is there another application? Ultimately, I believe that we were told, and we really look into the idea of the abomination of desolation. We look into what is God's wrath. As we think through that, we're going to find that His wrath is a removal of protection. He has told us where to live, how to live. That I don't think we understand the context of it. A lot of times we think, well, it's just more convenient in the city, or there's people I need to reach in the city, I have to do the work there. But when Ellen White specifies so many times about Enoch and the importance of doing ministry work like Enoch, she says Enoch did not live in the city. He lived outside the city and came into the city to preach, to share, and then those that were of interest, he brought them back out to his country home. And that's the idea of an outpost. Close enough to attack, but far enough away to shield. And I feel that, in some instances, Los Angeles has grown significantly, specifically around Los Angeles. And so some people, maybe were, technically in the country for a period of time until the sprawl enveloped them. But that's also a message that, okay, well, when the tide's rising, you have to keep walking backwards. If you're on a beach and you don't want to get your shoes wet, right? The tide rises, what do? You don't just stand there, you keep walking backwards. And I think there is a message to that. But also there's another message. We are to be the light of the world. And so it doesn't mean we have to go hide in a cave somewhere in the middle of the wilderness. There's still work to be done. And, while I do also think that, this is a ministry, any type of, online publication is a ministry that was not afforded to in her day and age. I think the message is clear, right? Far enough away to shield, but still got to be close enough to attack. And I do believe that there's going to only be more judgments pouring out on cities. And I believe that even if you were to take a secular viewpoint of this, right? Even if you were to say, well, let's just look at this secularly, what we find is, city life, ultimately there's more convenience, sure, but there's a lot more dangers. And also you're starting to put yourselves, like I said, I'm going to just take a completely secular approach on this, right? Just for those that may be interested in a different viewpoint. We have allowed ourselves to be brought into what we would see as really industrial supply chains. We're brought into systems that don't serve us, whether they're industrial education systems that train us to do industrial factory type jobs, factory type working jobs, that put us on a supply chain where you ask most people, where does a tomato come from? They're going to say, well, the store, right? They don't understand that you could actually grow that. Where does water come from? The sink. Well, it comes from the ground. It comes, right? The point is that there's been this disconnect of God's true education system. And I think that's what this comes down to, is recognizing what God's plan is, what his order is. Because in the great court case, that's what this is about. Is it the government of God and his way of living, or is it the way of man and his way of living? And we see the rebellion that came out of the lineage of Ham and how Nimrod built, massive cities, and that's what he was doing. Even before the Tower of Babel, he was building Nineveh. He was building so many other cities. That's not God's way. God wants us to have intellectual sovereignty. And it feels like that's what we've lost. It feels like we can't think for ourselves anymore. We can't, in fact, there's this idea of this growing tension, right? So many people, if on different platforms, we see this desire like, we got to get out the system. We got to fight back. There's a guy named Bill Mollison who's known for a thing called permaculture, which is a style, really a mindset, a philosophy of gardening. And Bill Mollison's quote says, you cannot, and I'll have to paraphrase it, but essentially the futility of revolutionaries who depend on the system they wish to attack. And I think that is just sums up the entire idea, is that so many of us feel like we want a better life, we want a better way, and yet we're not willing or not even cognizant to break free from that which enslaves us. And make no mistake, the system has enslaved all of us now. And it's just so powerful to see how we've given away right of conscience, freedom of conscience. And we see how many people were even willing to take and put a poison in their body in order to avoid losing their job, in order to avoid being ostracized from going into a supermarket or a movie theater. And I think that that's this concept of really rethinking our choices and figuring out, do we have intellectual sovereignty or not? And I think that's a greater point. So specifically about the quote of F.M. Ellen White, I believe it's true. But, that's this concept that I've already bought in to her credibility. So those that haven't bought into that yet could easily say, because again, I'm happy to have an argument from two sides, could easily say, well, you can, yes, she predicted it, but that was, 40 years ago. And, that could mean, a broken clock is right twice a year, or twice a day, I should say, right? And so, at some point, some year it's going to happen. And that's what the non-believers could say that. And I would have no real argument to prove otherwise. I think for me, it's, the wicked will not understand, but the wise will understand. And so her writing is for the wise that are already going to understand. I'm not going to defend that statement to somebody that doesn't believe in her, because you can't. But that's why I bring up, Paul. I love in Acts of the Apostles, Ellen White talks about how when Paul was in Athens, he challenged the men not with his logic, but by theirs. And I think we lost that. I think too many of us that want to prove a point, I've never actually thinking about what the other side actually believes. So we're arguing from a space where there is no common ground. And I'm the first one to say, you don't want to believe in God at all. I'll take that hat off. We'll talk as atheists, right? Because there is a logical explanation to everything, right? So I can happy to start at that foundation with you. And I think that's the difference between the way I see truth and the way others see it. And so again, that quote easily debunked, right? But also the wise will understand.
Correct. I like that. I appreciate the way you balance that answer. Because I look at it from a general perspective, and I also look at it from a specific perspective. So generally, contextually, specifically, you can't run with that quote and trying to build an entire narrative on that.
Right.
But at the same time, that quote does give a level of credibility to the people who understand her writings. So, I mean, people sharing it online, I just wanted to get the perspective on that. So you kind of helped me to balance a little bit, because that's kind of what I was thinking. I'm like, I didn't want to promote. I'm like, this needs to be properly examined. But at the same time, I don't think this should be something that we're running with and say, and then why is a prophet? Because of the following words. I'm like, well, she's a prophet because she has, we have so much.
Other reasons why I believe that.
I believe she is, because there's stronger evidence. For me, it's like just the exaltation of Christ alone in her writings is the greatest core of evidence. Because what you notice in all false prophets, they attack the very deity and the personality of Jesus. No false prophets can have a positive view of Christ. It goes against the very system, and Jesus says that a kingdom that is divided against itself cannot stand. So the devil cannot cast out Satan. So it is contrary to the kingdom of darkness to bring a false prophet that will promote the true Christ. That alone, without even talking about her life and her prediction that has come true, not even talking about the context of the great controversy. No, just the fact that she exalts Christ and the law in her writings, that does it for me. But I appreciate you giving me that answer, because that needed to be heard. So that's another segment that I plan on sharing with my audience.
I can share briefly.
Okay, go ahead.
Something, and I think that there is really. I think it comes down to, I think there's logical explanations, there's logical conversations that can be had, and if we were to kind of look ultimately at the sanctuary, and again, this is one of my courses called, what is inspired source of truth.
Okay.
But the short of it is, if we just look at the sanctuary system, it answers a lot of questions for us. And I feel like not enough of us have answered, have actually analyzed this. So this idea that every time Christ moves, a new church is formed. And we see this concept with the Israelites, in roughly 1500, where they were the children of the courtyard. And we see that through what happened. Like Christ came, he was baptized, his sacrifice, those were all things that happened in the courtyard. Then in 31 AD, we read that Christ went to the most holy place. Hebrews tells us, do you not know that you have a high priest in temples not made of hands? So Christ moved then to the holy place. This ultimately is the people of the holy place. And that was the early Christian church. Now, if we go to Daniel 8:14, 2300-day prophecy, puts us at 1844. Christ moves yet again. And I believe that this is the final church until Christ leaves the most holy place, in which case the 144,000 comprised the last church triumphant. But with that concept of this idea that there are three kind of buckets, if we go through these three buckets, we know, what did the Israelites have? The Israelites, they had the Old Testament. right? What did the early Christian church had? They had the New Testament. Nobody debates that. No one debates that today anyways, right? But what is interesting is the question, were the Old and New Testaments always accepted? And the answer is no, right? The Old Testament, which the Torah being the first part of the Tanakh, the Old Testament was actually challenged. Moses was challenged by the people of his day. Why do you lift yourself above us? Isn't God speaking to us too? Like, what makes you any more important, right? And we say, okay, well, what about the next, the prophets? Well, the minor prophets were also, ultimately, Ezekiel was called a madman, Isaiah was ignored, Jeremiah's prophecies, they're burned by King, so then let's get into the canon, right? Psalms was downplayed as just personal prayers. Ecclesiastes was too pessimistic, and Song of Solomon was a little bit too spicy, as we would say. And so those were actually that formed the Old Testament. And today, we have no question that the Old Testament is canon. And yet in their day and age, they were all questioned. And then when we move forward, the New Testament is just journals and letters, by the way, right? Like we think they just came down from heaven, but no, it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were literally just writing journals of what they saw Jesus do. And then we see Paul come to the scene, and now here's a guy that, used to be standing there executing Stephen, holding the coats. Well, they killed off, Stephen. Now this guy's like, whoa, let me start sending letters to the churches. So he sent a letter to Rome, Romans, Philippi, Philippians, Galatia, Galatians, right? Like we look at the Old Testament and we're like, okay, this is good. We look at the New Testament, like, yeah, this is totally good. But in its time, the New Testament was literally just letters to a church, right? So much of the New Testament was just letters. And then Hebrews was actually a little bit questioned, right? When we look at the final books, Jude, Revelation, Martin Luther and his canon was like, I think looks too much like acid. Like, I don't think that this was, even canonical. And he didn't believe in it. But I think God had a plan for that. God always has a plan. He wanted those books at the end because Revelation perfectly sums up the entire, what we lost in Genesis is restored in Revelation. So it needed to be there. So I guess the point I'm getting at is, if we start to think through this concept that every time every time Christ moves, a new church is formed, then if we believe the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the final church, what do we have for our source document? Who's writing letters for our time? And I think that's Ellen White, right? I believe that Ellen White fits. And, she's instructed that she's the Lord's messenger. There's so many quotes on here where, while she says, well, I have not claimed to be a prophet, it's because my work includes more than a prophet signifies. And people say, like, well, Ellen White even said herself she's not a prophet. Yeah, she says that she's more than a prophet, right? When we think back, like, who was John the Baptist? John the Baptist was more than a prophet because he led the way for Christ's return, first coming. Wow. Who's leading the way for Christ's return? Ellen White. So I think that when we get into this, we'll understand that, yes, she never put herself above the testimonies, because the same way the New Testament is not above the Old Testament. The New Testament must still comply and be right to the law and the testimony. If it speaks not according to these things, then there's no light in them. So if it's not true to the Old Testament, not true to the New Testament, then there's no light in it. And that's the question is, does Ellen White disagree with the Bible or agree with the Bible? Because if she disagrees anywhere, do not trust her, throw her out. But if she doesn't say anything that contradicts the Bible, then we have to make a decision. Is she a prolific writer, or is she the Lord's messenger? And I think with that, she reads, my commission embraces the work of a prophet, but it does not end there. It embraces so much more than the minds of those sowing seeds of unbelief can even comprehend. Those that are saying that she is not of God, they're just unable to even comprehend. And that's how I look at it. Again, that's through my lens. And so ultimately, we are not to despise against prophesying. We're to believe the prophets, but we need to make sure that we're doing it through the right lens. And so if someone says, but she called herself lesser light, yes, she did. But what is lesser light? When we read in Revelation, lesser light is the moon. It's the Old Testament. It's the New Testament. Lesser light is the moon that shines the sun. So any lesser light points to Jesus. So Jesus is the greater light. We find that throughout the entire Bible, the greater light, so many different quotes. We also find that the moon is the lesser light. And so you're light of the world. Therefore, as a man sent from God to bear witness of that light, he was not that light. He was there to bear witness to that light. So John is talking about bearing witness, right, of that light. The prophet John was the connecting link between two dispensations. As God's representative, he stood forth to show the revelation of the law of the prophets to the Christian dispensation. He was the lesser light to be followed by the greater. So Ellen White actually calls the New Testament lesser light. Now, again, it's this concept that whoever is testifying of God, pointing to God, we are to be the lesser light, right? We are to be the light bearers. We're so clear with that. And so this whole concept that somehow the Bible is greater than the spirit of prophecy, I feel is without context. And I feel that if we understood that everyone used to criticize, all messages from God were criticized. But if we understand that and put it into context, we're going to see that little heed is given to the Bible. The Lord has given a lesser light to lead men and women to the greater light. So she's calling the entire Bible lesser light. Because why? It's to lead the greater light. So all should be leading to the greater light. And I think if we get into that perspective, I think everything changes. And ultimately, what does she give us? She gives us the understanding of the most holy place. And that is what we are. We are the children of the most holy place. We're living the antitypical Day of Atonement. So we need to understand this grand truth. This is our present truth, right? To work in harmony with Christ, to prepare people to stand through the great day of God. And so anyways, that's the whole thing. So when we get into this idea of demoting the Lord's messenger, where in 2015, we actually changed our fundamental beliefs because some felt that the church's prior statement gave Ellen White authority comparable of the Bible. So in that, they removed as the Lord's messenger. And I think that was incredibly dangerous. And I think that when we look through that lens, we'll actually see that when they took out, as the Lord's messengers, right, they took out authoritative source of truth. And instead what they said was, rather than her speaking correction to the church, they said, that's what they added, they said to the church. Well, the difference was that she was actually writing for the church. So when we see this concept of they removed for the church and they added to the church, and there's a big, big difference there. And I think that needs to be understood. Anyways, again, I could go on forever on these types of topics, but I know that that's not what we were here to talk about. Yeah. But I mean, I've been studying this stuff for a while.
I love it.
I've got about 15,000 slides right now. So it's pretty much unlimited content. I just did a session with the students there. I talked nonstop the entire time, and I think I got through maybe 20% of what I wanted to tell them. So, anyways, my point is, I apologize for going too much into that. But
that was great. I was loving every soundbite.